A routine conversation on television slowly becomes one of the most uncomfortable moments of the show. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a standard celebrity interview slowly shifts into something more serious and slightly uncomfortable for everyone involved? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The moment unfolded during a regular weekday episode of The View, a show known for blending light entertainment with heavier social and political discussion. On this particular morning, the panel welcomed Oscar Isaac, who was there to promote an upcoming film project and talk about his recent work. The tone at the top of the segment was relaxed and familiar, the kind of atmosphere viewers of the show have come to expect. The hosts opened with casual praise for his performances, referencing his range as an actor and his ability to move between big franchise roles and smaller, more dramatic films. Oscar appeared comfortable from the start. He was smiling, leaning slightly forward in his chair, speaking in a calm and conversational way. The panelists laughed at a few light jokes about his busy schedule, his recent travel, and how he balances work with family life. The studio audience responded warmly, applauding at several points, and everything about the exchange felt routine, almost predictable, the kind of promotional segment that fits neatly into daytime television. As the conversation progressed, however, the focus slowly began to shift. One of the co-hosts pivoted from film to broader cultural topics, asking Oscar about how he views the role of actors in public conversations about social issues. This is a fairly common turn on The View, where entertainment interviews often drift into discussions about current events, politics, or social responsibility. Oscar responded carefully, saying that he believes artists naturally reflect the world they live in and that storytelling often becomes a way to process difficult realities. That answer set the stage for the question that changed the tone of the segment. Sunny Hostin, who is known for asking more pointed and analytical questions, leaned forward slightly and followed up. Her voice remained calm, but her wording was more direct. She asked Oscar whether he thought celebrities sometimes avoid taking clear positions on controversial topics out of fear of backlash or losing parts of their audience. At first, Oscar nodded thoughtfully. He said that it's a complicated situation and that people in public-facing jobs often feel pressure from many directions at once. He acknowledged that there is sometimes fear involved, but he also emphasized that not everyone processes or expresses their views in the same way. His tone was measured, and he seemed intent on keeping the discussion balanced. Sunny then pushed a little further. She referenced recent debates about actors speaking out on political issues and suggested that remaining neutral can sometimes be seen as a form of silence that indirectly supports the status quo. The way she framed the question wasn't aggressive, but it was clearly more challenging than the earlier parts of the interview. The studio audience quieted noticeably, and the other hosts shifted slightly in their seats, sensing the conversation was moving into more serious territory. Oscar paused before responding. This was one of those brief silences that feels longer on live television than it actually is. He took a breath and said that while he understands that perspective, he doesn't fully agree with the idea that public figures owe the audience a political stance on every issue. He explained that he believes individuals should speak when they feel informed and genuinely compelled, not because of expectation or pressure. Sunny listened closely and then replied that given the influence celebrities have, choosing not to speak can still have consequences, whether intentional or not. Her tone remained professional, but the difference in viewpoints was becoming clearer. At this point, Oscar's body language changed slightly. He sat more upright, his hands no longer resting casually in his lap, and his voice became more firm, though still calm. He responded by saying that he doesn't see silence and endorsement as the same thing, and that assuming intent behind someone's decision not to comment can be unfair. He emphasized that activism looks different for different people, and that some prefer to contribute privately rather than publicly. He added that the idea of constantly performing one's values for an audience can sometimes turn genuine issues into public spectacles. This is where the exchange shifted from polite discussion into something more clearly tense. Sunny countered by saying that public platforms come with responsibility, whether people ask for it or not. She argued that when millions of people listen to you, your voice, or lack of voice, holds weight. Her phrasing was careful, but the implication was direct. Oscar responded firmly, saying that responsibility should also include honesty about what you know and what you don't. He said that speaking just to be seen speaking can dilute serious conversations and turn them into trends rather than meaningful action. He made it clear that he wasn't dismissing activism, but he was pushing back against the idea that silence automatically equals complicity. At this moment, The other co-hosts subtly tried to soften the tension. One of them nodded and interjected briefly, saying that both perspectives made sense and that the issue is more complex than it appears. Another host attempted to reframe the discussion by asking how Oscar personally decides when to engage publicly and when to stay quiet. But the shift had already happened. The energy in the studio felt different. The audience was no longer reacting with easy laughter or applause, instead listening quietly, almost cautiously. Oscar answered the new question by saying that he relies on his own understanding of issues, his lived experiences, and conversations with people he trusts. He stressed that he doesn't want to contribute to noise or misinformation just to satisfy expectations. Sunny responded by acknowledging that point but reiterated that visibility itself creates influence, whether intentional or not. She said she respects personal boundaries but still believes that public figures can play a crucial role in shaping conversations, especially during moments of social tension. Oscar then delivered the line that many viewers later described as the moment he responded firmly. He said, calmly but clearly, that he doesn't think moral responsibility should be measured by how often someone speaks on camera, and that real impact often happens off-screen, in ways audiences never see. His voice remained steady, but the certainty in his tone was unmistakable. There was a brief pause after he finished. The hosts nodded, the audience offered a light, polite round of applause, and the conversation slowly began to move away from the disagreement. But the atmosphere had changed. What started as a standard promotional interview had become a genuine, unscripted exchange of perspectives. The kind of moment that feels real precisely because it isn't dramatic or explosive, just two people articulating fundamentally different views in real time. As the segment continued, the panel shifted back to discussing Oscar's upcoming project, but the earlier tension lingered subtly in the background. The questions became slightly safer, the tone more neutral. Oscar remained composed, but he spoke less expansively than before, offering shorter answers and fewer jokes. For viewers watching live, the moment stood out not because of raised voices or overt conflict, but because of how quietly and realistically it unfolded. It felt like a genuine disagreement, handled professionally, but impossible to ignore. The kind of exchange that reminds audiences that daytime talk shows aren't always about rehearsed opinions or comfortable conversations, but sometimes about real differences in perspective playing out in real time, right in front of the cameras. As the conversation moved forward, the hosts tried to ease the segment back into more familiar territory, but the shift in tone was still noticeable. Even though no one on the panel directly referenced the earlier exchange, the pacing had changed. The questions became more structured, less open-ended, and Oscar's responses were more carefully phrased, as if everyone in the studio was now more aware of the live nature of the discussion. One of the co-hosts asked Oscar about the themes of his new film and whether it reflected any of the social issues that had just been discussed. Oscar smiled politely and said that the project was more character-driven than political, but that, like most stories, it touched on human struggles that people could relate to in different ways. The answer felt intentionally neutral, not evasive, but clearly cautious. Sunny nodded and followed up by saying that storytelling itself can be a form of social commentary, even when it's not explicit. Her tone was softer than before, and she framed it more as a general observation than a challenge. Oscar agreed with that point, saying that art often carries meaning whether the creator intends it or not, and that sometimes the audience finds interpretations that surprise even the people who made the work. The audience responded with light applause, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the segment had fully recovered its earlier rhythm. The hosts laughed at a short anecdote Oscar shared about filming on location and dealing with unpredictable weather, and the atmosphere relaxed slightly. But the underlying tension hadn't completely disappeared. Viewers could sense it in the way the panelists were now more careful about interrupting each other, and in the way Oscar maintained steady eye contact with whoever was speaking, listening closely before responding. This wasn't the casual, free-flowing banter from the start of the interview. It felt more like a moderated discussion. Another co-host brought up the idea of public pressure, asking Oscar whether he feels that social media has changed the way actors engage with their audiences. This question indirectly circled back to the earlier disagreement, but in a less confrontational way. Oscar said that social media creates a sense of constant visibility, where people feel they are always expected to react in real time. He explained that this can be overwhelming and that it sometimes blurs the line between personal reflection and public performance. Sunny listened and then added that social media also gives people direct access to voices they might not otherwise hear, especially from marginalized communities. She suggested that this makes public engagement more important than ever. The way she phrased it was thoughtful and measured, but it clearly reflected her earlier position. Oscar responded with what many viewers later described as his most composed and clear answer of the segment. He said that he values listening as much as speaking, and that sometimes stepping back is his way of processing what others are saying. He emphasized that being present in conversations doesn't always mean leading them, and that there's a difference between amplifying voices and replacing them with your own. This time, the audience reacted more openly, with a mix of applause and murmurs of agreement. The hosts nodded, and one of them remarked that it was refreshing to hear someone talk about restraint in a culture that often rewards constant commentary. The discussion then briefly shifted to Oscar's background, his upbringing, and how his personal experiences shape the roles he chooses. This part of the segment felt more personal and less political. Oscar spoke about his family, his early interest in acting, and how moving between different cultures influenced his perspective on storytelling. Sunny asked whether those experiences made him feel more responsible to engage with social issues publicly. Her question was calm and curious, not confrontational, but it naturally brought the conversation back to the core disagreement. Oscar paused again, then said that his background makes him more sensitive to certain topics, but also more cautious about speaking on things he doesn't fully understand. He explained that he doesn't want to oversimplify complex issues or reduce them to sound bites. He said that while public conversations are important, they can sometimes become more about visibility than substance. His tone was still respectful, but there was a clear firmness in how he framed his position. Sunny responded by acknowledging that soundbite culture is a real problem, especially on television. She said that the format itself can limit how deeply topics are explored. However, she added that even within those limits, public figures still have an opportunity to signal values and priorities. At this point, one of the other hosts stepped in and said that this was exactly why The View exists as a show, to create space for different perspectives, even when they don't fully align. She smiled and said that disagreements like this are part of healthy dialogue, especially when they remain respectful. Oscar smiled back and agreed, saying that he appreciates having conversations where people don't necessarily think the same way. He said that disagreement doesn't have to mean conflict, and that listening to different viewpoints is part of learning. The audience applauded again, and the energy in the studio felt more balanced. The earlier tension hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into something more reflective. Instead of feeling awkward or uncomfortable, the exchange now felt like a thoughtful debate that had simply unfolded naturally on live television. As the segment approached its end, the hosts returned to lighter topics, asking Oscar about upcoming projects, future plans, and what kinds of roles he's excited to explore next. Oscar relaxed slightly, smiling more and offering longer, more animated answers. He joked about wanting to try something completely different from his recent work, maybe a comedy or a small independent film. The studio audience laughed, and the panelists joined in. The mood had clearly shifted back toward entertainment, but viewers who had been paying attention could still sense the impact of the earlier discussion. It wasn't something that could be completely erased by a few jokes or promotional questions. For people watching at home, the segment likely stood out because of how real it felt. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no viral one-liners. Instead, it was a quiet, steady disagreement about responsibility, influence, and public voice. The kind of exchange that doesn't feel scripted or manufactured, but simply emerges when people with different perspectives sit at the same table and talk honestly. What made the moment particularly compelling was that neither Oscar nor Sunny appeared to be trying to win the conversation. Both stayed calm, both listened, and both articulated their positions clearly. The tension came not from hostility, but from the fact that their views genuinely didn't fully align. In that sense, the segment reflected something audiences often appreciate about The View when it's at its best. It showed how a daytime talk show can move beyond surface-level chatter and into real discussion, without becoming sensational or confrontational. Oscar left the table with a polite goodbye, thanking the hosts for having him and saying he enjoyed the conversation. Sunny smiled and wished him luck with his upcoming projects. The audience applauded warmly as the show transitioned to a commercial break. But even as the cameras cut away, it was clear that this wasn't just another routine celebrity appearance. For many viewers, it was a moment that lingered, not because it was shocking, but because it felt authentic. Two thoughtful people, on live television, navigating a complex topic in real time, without a script, without theatrics, just a genuine exchange of ideas. When the show returned from the commercial break, the energy in the studio felt noticeably calmer, but there was still a sense that something meaningful had just taken place. The hosts resumed their usual rhythm, smiling, shuffling their cue cards, and transitioning into the next segment. Yet the earlier exchange with Oscar lingered in the background for anyone who had been paying close attention. Although the program moved on to a different topic, viewers could still see subtle traces of the discussion in the body language of the panel. The hosts were slightly more deliberate with their phrasing, and there was a general sense of caution in how questions were framed. It wasn't awkward, but it felt more reflective, as if everyone was aware that the previous conversation had crossed into more serious territory than originally planned. Oscar remained seated at the table for a few additional minutes as the show briefly covered another entertainment-related topic. He contributed lightly, nodding along and offering short remarks, but he was no longer the central focus. Still, the camera occasionally cut back to him, and his expressions suggested he was still engaged, listening closely to the ongoing discussion. For viewers at home, this part of the broadcast felt almost like a cooling-off period. The intensity of the earlier exchange had faded, but its impact hadn't disappeared. It was the kind of moment that doesn't resolve neatly within the time constraints of a television segment. Instead, it leaves behind a quiet sense of reflection. Soon after, Oscar officially said goodbye to the panel. He thanked them again for the invitation, shook hands with a couple of the hosts, and waved to the audience. The applause was warm and sustained, signaling that despite the disagreement, the interaction had been received positively by the studio crowd. Once Oscar exited the stage, the hosts briefly commented on what a thoughtful guest he had been. One of them remarked that it was refreshing to have conversations that go beyond surface-level promotion. Another added that respectful disagreement is what keeps discussions interesting and relevant. Sunny, in particular, made a short comment acknowledging that while she and Oscar didn't fully agree, she appreciated his honesty and the way he articulated his perspective. Her tone was calm and reflective, not defensive. It felt like a genuine attempt to emphasize that the exchange was about dialogue, not conflict. The show then moved fully into its next topic, and for the remaining broadcast time, the earlier moment wasn't directly referenced again. However, for many viewers, that was the part of the episode that stood out the most. As clips of the segment began circulating online later that day, it became clear that the conversation had resonated beyond the live audience. Short excerpts were shared on social media platforms, particularly the portion where Oscar talked about responsibility not being measured by how often someone speaks publicly. These clips were accompanied by captions highlighting his calm but firm tone. Comments from viewers were mixed but largely thoughtful. Some people praised Oscar for maintaining composure and expressing a nuanced view about public engagement. Others agreed with Sunny's perspective, arguing that public figures do have a responsibility to speak out, especially during times of social tension. Many viewers noted that what made the exchange compelling wasn't the disagreement itself, but the way it was handled. Rather than devolving into hostility or sound bites, the discussion stayed grounded. Both sides were given space to speak, and neither tried to dominate the conversation. That alone made the segment feel different from the kind of confrontations audiences sometimes expect from talk shows. Media outlets that cover daytime television also picked up on the moment. Some described it as a quietly tense exchange or a measured debate, emphasizing that it was notable precisely because it wasn't dramatic. There were no viral outbursts, no shocking remarks, just a genuine clash of perspectives presented in real time. This reaction highlighted something important about the way viewers engage with shows like The View. Audiences often appreciate authenticity more than spectacle. In a media environment where controversy is frequently amplified for attention, a calm disagreement can feel surprisingly refreshing. Oscar's response, in particular, was often described as firm but respectful. Viewers pointed out that he never dismissed Sunny's point, but simply offered an alternative way of thinking about responsibility and influence. That balance between disagreement and respect became one of the most discussed aspects of the segment. Sunny also received a significant amount of feedback. Many viewers praised her for asking thoughtful, challenging questions without becoming confrontational. Her approach was seen as consistent with her role on the panel, someone who often pushes conversations into deeper territory. What stood out to many was that neither person appeared to be performing for the cameras. There was no sense of trying to score points or generate headlines. The exchange felt organic, the kind of discussion that could easily happen in any real-life setting where people with different views sit down and talk. Behind the scenes, according to people familiar with how these shows operate, moments like this are not scripted or planned. While producers may suggest general topics, the specific direction of conversations often depends entirely on how guests and hosts respond in the moment. This is especially true for live or semi-live broadcasts, where there is limited opportunity to control the flow once a discussion begins. In that context, the exchange between Oscar and Sunny represented exactly what daytime talk shows aim to capture: unscripted, real-time conversation. It demonstrated how easily a promotional interview can shift into something more meaningful, simply through a few thoughtful questions and honest answers. For regular viewers, the segment also reinforced why the panel format works so well. Having multiple hosts with different perspectives creates space for varied viewpoints, and guests are often invited into those conversations rather than kept at a distance. This can lead to moments of genuine connection, but also moments of genuine disagreement. In this case, the disagreement didn't feel forced or uncomfortable. It felt like a natural result of two people approaching the same issue from different angles. Oscar emphasized personal boundaries and thoughtful restraint, while Sunny highlighted public responsibility and visibility. Both positions were valid, and neither was presented as definitively right or wrong. As the day went on, longer discussions appeared online, with viewers analyzing the exchange in more detail. Some debated the ethics of celebrity activism. Others focused on the broader question of whether public platforms automatically create moral obligations. The original segment became a reference point for these conversations, not because it provided clear answers, but because it framed the questions in a relatable way. For Oscar, the moment added a new dimension to his public image. He was already known as a thoughtful and articulate actor, but this exchange showcased his ability to engage in complex discussions without becoming defensive or dismissive. It reinforced the perception of him as someone who takes conversations seriously, even when they challenge him. For Sunny, the segment reaffirmed her role as a host who isn't afraid to ask difficult questions, even in the context of entertainment-focused interviews. Her willingness to engage with guests on deeper topics is part of what defines her presence on the show. In the end, what made this moment memorable wasn't any single line or reaction, but the overall tone of the exchange. It was calm, respectful, and honest. It didn't seek to entertain through conflict, but through conversation. For viewers, it served as a reminder that real tension on television doesn't have to involve shouting or drama. Sometimes, the most compelling moments come from quiet differences in perspective, expressed thoughtfully and handled with mutual respect. As the episode continued to circulate in online discussions, another layer of the moment began to stand out for viewers who re-watched the segment more closely. It wasn't just what Oscar and Sunny said, but how the entire panel subtly adjusted their behavior once the disagreement became clear. The shifts were small, but noticeable to anyone familiar with the rhythms of daytime television. During the original broadcast, the co-hosts had initially treated the exchange as a standard follow-up question, the kind that often leads to brief commentary before moving on. But as Oscar's answers became more deliberate and Sunny continued to press her point, the panel seemed to collectively recognize that the conversation had entered more sensitive territory. Interruptions became less frequent, jokes disappeared, and everyone gave each speaker more space to finish their thoughts. This is significant in the context of live talk shows, where overlapping dialogue and quick reactions are common. The fact that the hosts slowed down and allowed longer responses suggested that they, too, sensed the importance of what was being discussed. It created a different kind of atmosphere, one where the audience was invited to listen more carefully rather than simply be entertained. Viewers who watched the segment back later often pointed out Oscar's body language during this part of the conversation. He remained composed, but his posture changed slightly as the discussion deepened. He sat more upright, kept his hands still, and maintained steady eye contact with Sunny while she spoke. These details contributed to the perception that he was taking the exchange seriously, not just responding automatically or defensively. Sunny, on the other hand, appeared equally focused. She leaned forward slightly, nodding as Oscar spoke, even when she disagreed with him. This visual dynamic reinforced the idea that the conversation was grounded in genuine engagement rather than confrontation. Neither person seemed interested in dominating the discussion or delivering a rehearsed message. From a production standpoint, moments like this are often considered both valuable and risky. Valuable because they generate authentic content that audiences respond to, and risky because they can't be fully predicted or controlled. In this case, the exchange remained within the boundaries of respectful daytime conversation, which allowed it to air without any need for editing or damage control. What made the moment resonate with so many viewers was its familiarity. It resembled real-life conversations people have with friends, colleagues, or family members about social responsibility and public voice. The same arguments, the same pauses, the same careful phrasing. It didn't feel like a performance, but like a real discussion that happened to be broadcast. As more people shared the clip, commentary began to focus on the broader implications of the exchange. Some viewers said it reflected a growing tension in modern media, where public figures are constantly expected to comment on everything, while others argued that this expectation is a natural result of having influence in a connected world. Interestingly, many comments avoided taking strong sides. Instead of declaring one person right and the other wrong, people discussed how both perspectives could coexist. This suggested that the segment had succeeded in doing something relatively rare in televised debate, encouraging reflection rather than polarization. A number of viewers also pointed out that the conversation unfolded without any sense of urgency or emotional escalation. There were no dramatic pauses, no raised voices, no attempts to provoke a reaction. This made the disagreement feel more credible, because it didn't rely on theatrical elements to hold attention. In a media environment where conflict is often exaggerated, the calmness of the exchange became its defining feature. The tension came not from aggression, but from the simple fact that two intelligent people saw the same issue differently and were willing to articulate their reasoning in front of an audience. This aspect of the segment also influenced how people interpreted Oscar's response. The phrase "responds firmly" didn't mean he became confrontational or defensive. Instead, it referred to the clarity and consistency of his position. He didn't waver, but he also didn't dismiss Sunny's concerns. He simply stated his view and stood by it. Sunny's role in the exchange was equally important. She didn't push the conversation into hostile territory, even when she disagreed. She acknowledged Oscar's points, restated her own, and allowed the discussion to evolve naturally. This balance between challenge and respect is part of what made the moment feel authentic. Over time, the segment became one of those quiet reference points that people return to when discussing how public discourse can function on television. It wasn't a viral explosion, but it was a steady presence in conversations about talk show dynamics and celebrity engagement. For longtime viewers of daytime talk shows, the moment also served as a reminder of why these formats still matter. Despite changes in media consumption and the rise of short-form content, there is still value in watching people talk through complex issues in real time, without heavy editing or scripting. The exchange also highlighted how easily a promotional interview can transform into something more substantive. Oscar came on the show to discuss a film, but left having contributed to a broader conversation about public responsibility, influence, and personal boundaries. This kind of shift is unpredictable, but often memorable. In many ways, the segment worked precisely because it wasn't planned. There was no setup for a debate, no announcement that a serious topic was about to be discussed. It emerged naturally from the flow of conversation, which made it feel genuine rather than staged. As a result, viewers didn't treat it like a headline or scandal. They treated it like a conversation worth thinking about. Some agreed with Oscar, some with Sunny, and many with parts of both. But most seemed to agree on one thing: the exchange felt real. That realism is what ultimately gave the moment its impact. Not the content alone, but the way it unfolded, calmly, respectfully, and without spectacle. It showed that tension on television doesn't always have to be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes, it just has to be honest. By the time the episode reached its final minutes, the earlier conversation had fully blended into the overall flow of the show. But for many viewers, it remained the most memorable part of the broadcast. The hosts wrapped up their last topic, thanked the audience, and closed the episode in the usual way, with smiles, light banter, and a sense of routine professionalism. There was no formal reference back to the exchange with Oscar, no recap, no attempt to frame it as a special moment. It ended the way most daytime television moments do, quietly, without emphasis. But that understated ending was part of what made the segment linger. It wasn't presented as a headline event. It simply existed as something that happened. Inside the studio, the audience reaction at the end of the show was warm and relaxed. People applauded, chatted among themselves, and prepared to leave, just as they would after any regular taping. There was no visible tension, no sense that something had gone wrong or needed to be addressed. From the perspective of those in the room, it had been a thoughtful conversation that stayed within the boundaries of respectful discussion. Once the episode aired, however, the reaction outside the studio unfolded more gradually. Viewers began discussing the moment online, not in the way that typically accompanies viral talk show clips, but in a slower, more reflective way. Instead of trending hashtags or dramatic headlines, there were long comment threads and discussion posts where people analyzed what had been said. Some viewers focused on Oscar's point about responsibility not being defined by constant public commentary. They described his response as grounded and realistic, especially in a media environment where celebrities are often expected to speak instantly on complex issues. For these viewers, his firmness came across as thoughtful restraint rather than avoidance. Others leaned more towards Sunny's perspective, arguing that influence inevitably comes with obligation, whether someone seeks it or not. They felt her questions were necessary and reflective of a broader concern about how public figures shape conversations, intentionally or otherwise. What stood out was that the discussion rarely became hostile. People disagreed, but in a way that mirrored the tone of the original exchange. Calm, measured, and focused more on ideas than personalities. That in itself was unusual for online discourse, where conversations often become polarized very quickly. Several media commentators noted that the segment worked because it didn't rely on confrontation. There was no dramatic turning point, no emotional escalation, no attempt to frame one person as right and the other as wrong. Instead, it presented two coherent viewpoints and allowed the audience to interpret them. This approach also shaped how the moment was remembered. It wasn't labeled as a clash or a blow-up. It was more often described as a firm response or a thoughtful disagreement. The language used by viewers reflected the calm nature of the exchange. In follow-up discussions on entertainment news platforms, the segment was occasionally referenced as an example of how talk shows can host meaningful conversations without turning them into spectacles. Some analysts pointed out that this kind of moment is easy to overlook precisely because it doesn't create instant drama, but it often has a longer-lasting impact. From the show's perspective, there was no official statement, no clarification, and no attempt to reshape the narrative. The hosts continued with their usual format in subsequent episodes, and Oscar did not publicly comment further on the exchange. It remained a standalone moment, existing only within the context of that single broadcast. That lack of follow-up actually reinforced the authenticity of the segment. It didn't feel like part of a larger media strategy or promotional arc. It felt like a real conversation that happened once and then moved on, just like many real-life discussions do. For viewers, the lasting impression wasn't about who won or who made the better argument. It was about how the conversation unfolded. Two people with different perspectives, speaking calmly, listening to each other, and maintaining respect even while disagreeing. In the landscape of daytime television, where segments are often tightly structured and designed for easy consumption, moments like this stand out quietly. They don't demand attention, but they invite reflection. They don't resolve complex issues, but they make space for thinking about them. The segment ended the same way it began, as part of a routine episode. But for many people watching, it became a small reminder of why live television still matters. Not because it produces viral moments, but because it captures real-time human interaction, complete with uncertainty, pauses, and genuine differences in opinion. In the end, the exchange between Oscar and Sunny didn't change the format of the show, didn't redefine celebrity interviews, and didn't spark a major controversy. What it did was something much quieter. It showed what respectful disagreement can look like in a public space. And that, for a lot of viewers, was enough to make it memorable. So now, after hearing the full breakdown of what happened on the show, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.